Hello everybody and welcome to DevFacto's Office 365 Fireside Chat. My name is Oliver Wirkus. I'm a SharePoint MVP and I'm a senior consultant with DevFacto. Today I'm joined by an old friend from Germany and a fellow MVP, Matt Einig from Germany, from Rencore. Matt is currently traveling from all the way from Germany to Seattle, and he was so kind to stop by here in Vancouver to meet me and to talk with me today about SharePoint migrations. Matt, I think everybody knows Rencore, but would you mind to introduce yourself?
Hi, Oliver. Great to be here. Yeah, thank you for the invite. Rencore, I'm not sure if everybody knows Rencore. So as you already mentioned, my name is Matt or Matthias Einig. I'm also an MVP in Office Servers and Services for many, many years already. Rencore, we are a software vendor and help organizations in various aspects. One of them is organizations who customize SharePoint and Office 365 to make sure that the customizations that they are building are of good quality, performance, secure, and so on. So this is our bread and butter business, if you want.
I see.
The second area where we help organizations is with migrations, the topic that we are talking about today, and not necessarily about content migration. So we are not a content migration tooling vendor. We help organizations to assess existing environments that they want to migrate and make sure that they have the right plan in order to have a smooth migration going on and with the least hurdles in between. And the third area where we help organizations is monitoring and governing their Office 365 environments, that whatever is happening there is controlled and we automate the governance behind of it.
Makes sense, yeah. Thank you very much. So today we're talking about SharePoint migrations, and whenever I have a session at a conference, I usually start with a SharePoint migration matrix. That's how I call it. So when we look at migrations, we have migrations from Fileshare to SharePoint Online. We can have a migration from, let's say, an old SharePoint on-premises environment to SharePoint Online. And sometimes here in North America, we have migrations from SharePoint on-premises to SharePoint on-premises. But the most migrations that we do here in Canada and North America, those are Fileshare migrations, which means Fileshare to SharePoint Online, and SharePoint on-premises to SharePoint Online. How are things in Europe? How are things in Germany? What are your experiences regarding SharePoint migrations?
So I would say, in general, the previous years, Office 365 was still, quite low adopted, especially in Germany and Western Europe. Yep. Office 365 was still unclear. Do we want that? Do we want our data in the cloud? But that mindset is changing, in my opinion, at least from what I see from our customers. More and more customers are starting to adopt the cloud and are migrating their on-prem investments also into the cloud. So there is a booming business there with migrations, for sure. I would say Fileshare migrations from Fileshare to SharePoint on-prem or in the cloud are rather seldom, at least from my experience, especially because SharePoint itself, SharePoint on-prem, has been adopted heavily over the many years SharePoint is around. So especially around 2007, 2008, there was a very booming time in Europe and Western Europe around SharePoint. So many of the customers, large customers, particularly, are already on SharePoint anyway.
Yeah, that's true for North America as well. But what I was experiencing here is that we have a lot of Fileshare to SharePoint migrations and a lot of on-premises to SharePoint Online migrations. That is what I did in the recent years. So looks like it's still a bit different compared to Europe and compared to Germany.
I think in Europe you also have to differ where around you are in Germany. Scandinavia is adopting cloud much longer already. Similar Benelux. But Germany, France, Switzerland, they are always more hesitant in adopting these kinds of technologies.
I see. Is there a reason why?
I guess especially Germans are generally quite suspicious about the cloud and also suspicious where the data is hosted. So data sovereignty is a really, really important topic. Yeah. And hence cloud, especially as long as there were no data centers in Germany and Switzerland, that was always considered to be less secure than having it in your own data center.
I see. Okay, perfect. Let's focus on Fileshare migrations. Let's start with the easy topics. So when I'm supporting or assisting clients with Fileshare migrations, I usually start with an assessment because, well, you need to know what you want to migrate, right? So assessment here means I'm looking at files, documents, file sizes, types of documents, the structure that is in the Fileshare, the folder, the Fileshare structure. And this assessment, I think, is necessary at the beginning just to be able to do a thorough planning. What are your experiences in terms of Fileshare migrations and assessments?
So I believe in general, it doesn't matter if it's a Fileshare migration or any other migration, an initial assessment is necessary in any case because you don't know what you don't know.
Exactly.
You have to plan. And in order to plan, you need to know what is the status quo at the moment.
Yes.
And in regards of Fileshare migrations, well, the limiting factors are, of course, file sizes, file types that might not be supported, file names that are not supported, but also mapping the structure that has been built in the Fileshare for many, many years by the organization, trying to figure out and plan how does that map to an Office 365 or a SharePoint site structure, making sure which files go where, who gets access to it, and especially in Fileshares, at least from my experience, the privileges who has access to it is often much broader. Like you are not having a different access for a folder within the Fileshare. Either you have access to the Fileshare, maybe to one sub-level below, but that's more or less it. And in SharePoint, you have a way more granular access management, and that needs to be mapped somehow when you do the migration, and makes the whole migration more complicated.
Yes. And well, in my experiences, if you do a Fileshare migration, which means a migration from a Fileshare to SharePoint Online, this often happens with organizations who are not that familiar with Office 365. So many organizations who are migrating from a Fileshare to SharePoint Online, they are first-time users of Office 365 and SharePoint Online. And I think it's kind of, or it can be a little bit difficult, or it can be tricky to explain the need for an assessment to these organizations, especially as you just mentioned, the access rights are different from a Fileshare to SharePoint Online. We have a different structure in SharePoint Online compared to a Fileshare. Do you have any recommendations how to teach or how to explain these differences to clients who are not that familiar to Office 365?
I think in general the problem there is that it is change in the organizations, and organizations that have been using Fileshares for, 20 plus years, people just don't want to change and don't want to adapt new technology. And if everything is newly structured and suddenly your files are mostly available on a website, that is a very different way of working for the employees than it was previously when you just open Explorer, connect to your drive, and then have the files there accessible. So I think it hasn't, at least in my opinion, not necessarily something to do with the technical assessment of the existing Fileshares, but more with an assessment of the way the organization is working and making an adoption plan for the organization. And this is where usually consultants come in who have the experience and interview the departments and train the departments how they can leverage the new technology, and maybe even teach them how they can use, for example, OneDrive in order to sync back the files from the SharePoint side, so that it is basically for them not that much of a difference to handle those files, and they are synced back in the background.
Exactly. That's what we do at DevFacto as well. So for us, user adoption, change management, that is super important. And even though we are talking about an assessment at the beginning, we usually start with user adoption campaigns or user adoption management, change management right at the beginning, just to ensure that we're all on the same page and that the client knows what we are doing, even when we start with a basic assessment at the beginning. With an assessment, we usually look at structures as well. And structures here, I mean, a structure in the term store, the managed metadata structure, right? A structure based on term groups, term sets, and terms. Another structure is the structure that you need to build in the content type hub, which means you need to have at least a basic hierarchy of content types. And last but not least, and this I think is most important, we need to have a site structure in SharePoint as well. And I think for some clients it's hard to understand why there needs to be a different structure in SharePoint compared to the file and folder structure in your file share. That is something that we need to do with clients as well. And I usually call this an art of the possible workshop. So we are teaching clients how to build structure. We're teaching clients about the need for metadata, content types, site structure, and so on. What would be your approach to this? What would be your best practices, your recommendation when it comes to structures in SharePoint?
Well, I have to admit, I'm not personally involved in consultancy anymore. I've been a consultant many years before I started Rencore, and we are now more focusing on software vendor, being a software vendor and providing the tools to help consultants like DevFacto to get the data to make these kind of decisions and base these decisions on the facts that we gather with our software.
Yeah.
But in general, from my experience, some things have changed, of course, a lot, especially in Office 365. In previous days, when I was still in the consulting business, it was very common to build structures with sites and subsites and have a rather complex structure within a site collection.
Yeah.
Whereas nowadays, especially when you look also in Microsoft Teams and Office groups, it's a very flat hierarchy. That is basically a site collection per team or per department, and you try to avoid actually a deeper site structure within the site. And that changes, of course, the entire mindset, how you deal with the data. But it also gives you a lot of flexibility. One of the biggest challenges that I experienced when I was still a consultant, when you create like these deep hierarchical structures, is that usually organizations don't stay as they are. They constantly change.
Oh, yeah.
An organization is constantly reorganizing, departments are merging, are split up, teams are created, projects are created, are closed, abandoned, whatever. And then you need to know what to do with the data and how to move these things around and restructure.
Exactly, yes.
And if you have a very hierarchical structure, that complicates the entire thing, because as soon as you want to change something, all the URLs are changing, everything is moving around. Whereas if you have a technical flat structure, everything is basically its self-contained container. It allows, and the navigation around it is basically virtual. You just plump the different sites together how they make sense at the moment. It makes it much easier to be able to adapt also to organizational changes over the time. My personal recommendation, when we talk about site structure, is basically keep the flat structure and have the richer structure only, for example, through metadata navigation and things like that.
Which means you need to apply the logical structure to, for example, the main navigation, and keep the technical structure as easy or as simple as possible.
Separate these two things. That's my personal recommendation.
Exactly. You just mentioned the Rencore tools. How can these tools help organizations to build these structures?
So what we do with our tools, especially in the migration area, we help organizations to assess the status quo. So we, first of all, gather all the data that is possible to retrieve from the existing environment, and that is more targeting on-prem environments and also cloud environments, because also cloud-to-cloud migrations are things that are happening within our customers, for example, for merger and acquisitions or carve-outs of specific business units into new organizations. So there you need to also plan your migrations. So what we can do with our tooling is gather all the data, what has been already in the existing environment, how has it been used, how is it structured, how big is the data, are there customizations built on top of that structure? So are there, let's say, workflows, forms, but also custom code that has to be built? And we gather all that and help organizations to cluster basically all that information in a way. We call that migration quadrants. So we divide basically in 4 quadrants what to do with the data, and you can then decide, for example, if data hasn't been used for a certain period of time, no access within the last 180 days, and this data might be not needed anymore and could be rather archived instead of being migrated, which reduces the entire effort also in the migration process and can speed up the migration project at the end. Or if there are customizations on top of it, of the existing environment, we can help to assess, are these customizations still used? Are they possible to be migrated? Do they need to be modernized? Or if they are not used, how can they be decustomized in order to basically get the SharePoint site back to bare bones, to have it back in its standard phase, to have an easy content migration at the end?
I see, yeah, exactly. We just talked about structures, and to be honest, there's one topic that, at least for some organizations, can be a little bit tricky. So at the beginning, we talked about migrations from SharePoint on-premises to SharePoint in the cloud, or SharePoint online. So if organizations use SharePoint on-premises for a long time, they usually started with classic sites. And they added additional classic sites. They have built a classic site hierarchy, sites and subsites and so on. And now this organization wants to move over to SharePoint Online. In SharePoint Online, we have the new shiny modern sites, which provide a lot of benefits to organizations, right? So many organizations struggle with, what should we do with the classic sites? And that is where I think the expertise of consultant comes into play, and that is what we at DevFacto do. We actively work with clients on an additional assessment regarding these classic sites. What are these classic sites used for? How are the departments using these classic sites? Is there any option to modernize these sites? You just mentioned modernization. I think that's true for sites as well. And at the end of this assessment, we decide, okay, which sites can stay classic sites, which sites need to be modernized, need to be migrated to, let's say, the modern communication sites. I think that's a big topic for many organizations. So what is your thinking here in terms of classic sites and modern sites?
So this is, of course, also part of the assessment tooling that we provide. So we help consultants like yourself to provide them the insights to make the sound decisions what to do with those classic sites. So we have a part in our assessment which is a modernization readiness or classic to modern readiness assessment per site, where we identify what is actually blocking the modernization of a specific site. So what components are used. Let's say, for example, there are blocks used within a site, and that is not available in modern sites in that way, so that needs to be modernized. But if we identify that this block maybe hasn't been used at all, then on the first side it appears that this is blocking your modernization, but actually you can decustomize that site, and suddenly it's ready for modernization, and you can create a modern site out of it. Or similar, a big blocker for modernization of sites is, for example, info forms. And often organizations don't even know that they use info forms, because some user might have just created a custom list form of an existing list, and might not even have customized that form, but just tried it out, and suddenly you have a custom list form. This is something that we can identify in our modernization assessment, and can basically help the migration planning team to decide, okay, what to do with that. Can we decustomize these modern list forms? Can we replace the info forms maybe with a Power App? Can we move these things away out of that site so that we can modernize that specific site and remove the blockers basically, and re-implement them, modernize also these customizations, or decustomize the site in order to enable the modernization.
That's a great technical view on this issue, but you see, I think it makes sense to have both. Your technical assessment, your tools, and the expertise of consultants like the consultants at DevFacto to help clients to decide what to do with the classic sites. Because I think classic sites, that is one of the major topics for today's migration.
I totally agree. What we do with our tooling is just provide the insights and the advice, but at the end, most of the customers are not experts in migrating SharePoint. So they don't often know what to do with this information. So this is where the expertise of consultants come in order to make sense out of this and plan the migration and advise the customer what is the next step and how to proceed in the migration. Exactly. A similar topic around that is Teams readiness. We also identify automatically if a site is team ready, and team ready means basically it is a site that uses features that are considered nowadays to be standard features of a team. So, for example, in a team, we have conversations, we have document libraries, short documents, we may have tasks that are now maybe end up in Planner, and so on, and trying to combine these. We identify is a site similar in the kind of how it's used to what is nowadays considered to be the common type of usage of a Microsoft team, and can give the organization or the consultants who plan the migration an indication, okay, these sites should maybe become a team in the future instead of becoming just an ordinary SharePoint site.
That is a great feedback. Yes, I think that will help a lot of organizations to decide, okay, how can we modernize existing sites, and they can solve this classic site, modern site dilemma. I think another thing is, and I think you kind of mentioned that, many organizations using workflows. So when they start with SharePoint on premises, they usually start with the out-of-the-box workflows in SharePoint on premises, like the approval workflow, right? We all know this approval workflow. There can be additional workflows, like the workflows you can create with SharePoint Designer. Many organizations, especially here in North America, they are using Nintex or Nintex workflows. And when it comes to a migration from SharePoint on premises to SharePoint Online, we also need to migrate these workflows. And here again, we at DevFacto do a kind of assessment, which means we look at the workflows, we try to identify the type of workflows, and we are looking at ways and options how to migrate these workflows over to SharePoint Online. But this can be kind of tricky because these workflows have been built, in most cases, many, many years ago. And they need to be modernized as well when they are migrated to SharePoint Online. Or it makes sense to modernize them, right? So you just mentioned your tools. How can the Rencore tools help with assessing workflows and migrating workflows?
Yeah, we do exactly the same with our assessment. We look into the workflows. What workflows are there? What type of workflows they are? So if there are standard approval workflows, we identify those. We map those then. Are these available, for example, with Power Automate? And in order to allow organizations to swap basically the existing workflow with a new Power Automate flow. The difference there is, of course, we also look into the usage. So only because there is an approval workflow doesn't mean that it has been used for a while. So we also look in open instances. So if there are instances of that workflow that have been started in a certain time frame, are they still active or not, to help at the end the people who are running the migration to decide what to do with these kind of workflows. Similar, we work very closely together with Nintex, so we also identify Nintex workflows and Nintex forms. Many of the customers who are using our tools also are Nintex customers and want to know, of course, where they have made the investments in Nintex workflows and forms and how to get them to the cloud. So again, what does the Rencore tooling do? The Rencore tooling gathers the insights and gives the advice how to proceed. But at the end, somebody with the experience needs to plan the migration and make the actual migration. The Rencore tools in general are all about providing insights and giving advice. So no matter which tooling you're looking at, but in particular in the migration assessment tooling, this is the main focus here, to get the information out of the environment without having to crunch the numbers all manually through endless of Excel lists, but trying to get the numbers together in a way to visualize them, to plan, and then when you need to deep digger, you can look deeper, you can look into the actual details. We visualize the workflows also without needing the workflow designer. We visualize the forms without needing InfoPath. You can basically take that offsite, take that off the existing farm, and analyze the entire data. We decompile the code behind the forms and show you what kind of code behind was developed by the forms designer in order to decide, okay, is that so complex that we need to modernize that, or is that something that might be actually already capability that now exists in new forms or workflow approaches that exist in Microsoft Power Automate or Microsoft Power Apps.
You just mentioned Power Automate, which was formerly known as Microsoft Flow. Microsoft changed the name. How is it for clients or organizations in Europe? Is Power Automate an interesting additional feature to build corporate workflows compared to SharePoint Designer on the one side, or let's say Nintex on the other side? So is Power Automate a competitor to Nintex? Are many organizations thinking about switching from, let's say, out-of-the-box or SharePoint Designer workflows to Power Automate? Or are they thinking about switching from, let's say, Nintex back to, or I shouldn't say back, but back to Power Automate or Flow? Is that something that organizations do in Europe?
I think it depends very much on the use case. So the very basic use cases are easily done with Power Automate, but the strength of solutions like Nintex are basically the integration and business process management that you get behind of it. So as soon as these workflows become more complex, need auditing behind of it in order to verify who has done what and so on, then solutions like Nintex are, where I think, still higher value than what Power Automate is currently providing. On the other hand, Power Automate is, of course, catching up quite quickly. Microsoft is heavily investing, providing new functionality. Also, the new RPA functionalities for rapid process automation are helping, of course, a lot in order to get adoption. What we see with our customers, often the decision to do one or the other goes down to the costs. And,
exactly,
it used to be that Nintex was more costly than Power Automate, but since Microsoft changed licensing in autumn last year, which is not in effect for every customer, but might go into effect in the next 3 years, depending on the enterprise agreement of the customer, suddenly Nintex becomes competitive again, because Power Automate, especially when you use the premium connectors within Power Automate, becomes suddenly very costly. This is where we come in with our governance tooling, because we also analyze existing environments, online environments, what kind of flows in Power Automate have been created, what kind of components they are using, if they use, for example, premium connectors, and we can identify how the licensing of the users is currently structured in order to tell you, oh, you have, 500 Power Automate flows. Of these 500, 100 are using premium connectors. These are used by a bunch of users, and these users don't have the right license. So it will cost you, as soon as that new licensing kicks in, cost you a certain amount more to run these workflows. And then you need to use that as part of your calculation. Okay, is maybe an alternative solution the better option for me or not?
I see, yes. So we just talked about modernization, and there are some types of workflows in SharePoint that I think need to be modernized when you migrate from an on-premises environment to SharePoint Online. And these are the out-of-the-box workflows in SharePoint, the classic approval, or the collect feedback workflow. And there are the old workflows created by using SharePoint Designer. So my recommendation usually is, okay, if I'm identifying SharePoint Designer workflows when planning a migration with an organization or with a client, I usually have a closer look at these workflows, and I'm looking for options to replace them. And usually my recommendation is, okay, let's get away from the old SharePoint Designer workflows and let's switch to a modern platform. And usually my recommendation is to use Power Automate or Flow. What is your thinking here? Does it make sense?
I totally agree with that. So this is exactly what we do as well with our assessment. So we identify the activities which are used in a SharePoint Designer workflow. We have a mapping to Power Automate activities, and we can give the person who is looking into migration the insights. Does that workflow, or what percentage of that workflow is actually achievable with Power Automate, both with standard and with premium license? and help you to make the decision, is that the valid way to go, for example, to Power Automate. Into that decision comes, of course, is that workflow used at all? So
yes.
you might want to abandon that workflow right from the start. Might be super complex, might be super easy, but if nobody's using it, you shouldn't even think about moving it to a new environment. And that it cannot necessarily always be done also only with a technical solution like ours, but you also, as part of your migration process, you also need to interview the business who is using the workflow, for example, or the form, because often what I've seen, the business is not even aware that they are using a custom solution, and they might be actually dissatisfied with that custom solution, how is it currently implemented. So if you take that approach that you just make a one-to-one migration, let's say from SharePoint Designer Workflow to Power Automate, then at the end, the customer might not be happy with the result because it's still doing the same inefficient way that they had before, but you could have actually used that opportunity to adjust to maybe change business requirements that have modified over the time from when the initial workflow has been created.
Absolutely,
so this is where you need to first identify, is the workflow used? If it's used, identify, can it be or modernized into a technology that is available on the target platform? And when that is a yes, then you talk about with the business, okay, is it actually still the thing that you want, or do you want something different? So I think it's not such a simple answer how to proceed there, and it always includes a technical and a personal component.
Absolutely, I totally agree to that, and it also includes user adoption and change management activities, especially if you switch from an old SharePoint Designer workflow to, for example, Power Automate. That's a different platform, that's a different look and feel, that's a different user experience. And I think that definitely requires change management activities, at least with the department that is using this workflow. Modernization, I think that's a big topic here, and whenever I'm supporting organizations with migrations, very soon I identify custom solutions. Yeah, exactly, that is my thinking as well. When an organization is using SharePoint on premises for a long time, for many, many, many years, it's likely that they have created their own solutions, their own line of business solutions, and they were using these solutions. Now that they are thinking about migrating to the cloud, to, for example, SharePoint Online, these organizations realize that they can't just migrate their custom solutions from an on-premises environment to SharePoint Online. In most cases, this can't be done because these custom solutions, they were built on server-side code. And as we all know, server-side code is not allowed in the cloud. So we need to find ways what to do with the existing line of business applications, how to modernize these applications, how to move this application to the cloud. And in essence, usually there are a few options that organizations have. And I think these options are take these line of business applications and host these business applications elsewhere outside of the SharePoint environment in Azure, for example. That is one option, or that can be one option. Another option could be, recode that application, switch from server-side code to client-side code, or if that application or this line of business application is something that this organization bought from a third-party vendor, well, you need to contact that third-party vendor to see if there's a cloud-compatible version. But I think you know what I'm talking about, and I'm pretty sure that the Rencore tools will provide some additional help for users when it comes to migrating line of business applications, especially custom applications from an on-premises environment to SharePoint Online. Am I right?
You're totally right. This is where we focus mostly on. I think it starts already a step earlier, and that is what we've discussed before already with the other areas. First of all, customers often have no clue what is actually customized and that things are customized at all. There has been a Gartner study a couple of years back where Gartner basically stated that 9 out of 10 SharePoint installations are customized. In our experience,
really? Wow.
in our experience, 10 out of 10 SharePoint installations are customized. We have.
Okay.
The question is how you define how it's customized. Yeah. Many organizations believe, okay, customization is just we have farm solutions. Often they don't even know that they have farm solutions on their environment. But there are many different kind of customizations. We mentioned already workflows and forms, but often a lot of sites are also customized, for example, with content editor web parts or JavaScript web parts, where people modified something, added code, JavaScript code, that they found somewhere in a blog post on the web in order to enrich the interface or add data, and IT has no clue that these kinds of customizations exist. On the other hand, you have the actual farm solutions, and we have customers who have SharePoint on-prem environments with 100+ farm solutions running on that environment, and often they don't even know where those come from. They had multiple suppliers over many, many years who provided custom-built solutions. They don't have the source code. They don't know where it's used. They don't know what it actually does. And that this is information that is, of course, necessary in order to make a decision what to do with these customizations when you go into a new environment or into the cloud. And this is where the Rencore tooling comes in again.
Okay.
Rencore migration assessment tooling is gathering all these customizations. It is decomposing the customizations. We are actually decompiling the code that has been created and allow you to get insights what that code is actually doing. So even if you do not have the source code anymore of that specific customization, you can still get an understanding what the customization was actually built for and what it was used for. Our tooling is also looking into, is this customization actually still active in use? Because, well, if it's not in use, you can probably abandon it and recustomize it. So that's the first step in our experience. First of all, to understand what you have. Then understand, do you still need it?
I agree.
And then identify if you still need it, what to do with it. And then we come to what you mentioned before. Do we modernize the customization in a way like, for example, a farm solution could be just actually declarative structure of content types and site definitions and so on, which can be rather easily migrated. We can, with our tooling, automate that migration into modern development approaches. So it generates, for example, PNP PowerShell provisioning script. PNP provisioning template that can be deployed with a PowerShell script. So we can help in that process. But there can be also more complex customizations that don't have an equivalent in the new modern development approaches. You don't have the server-side code, as you mentioned. Maybe some things need to be moved to Azure Functions. Some things are done in SPFX, SharePoint Framework. And also, again, the same thing what I mentioned before with the workflows, often the business requirements might have changed. So only blindly modernizing the customization from old to new technology might not do the thing. At the end, the customer might have no longer need for it, might even know that it is used. Simple example, let's say, for example, branding, adjusting branding. Very common customization. I think I have yet to find a SharePoint environment that has not at least the slightest adjustments in branding. And that has been usually done with master pages, with CSS, with delegate controls, getting changes into the page, and so on. That was the old approach. Blindly migrating that into the new environment will probably not make is the right decision, because the customer might actually want to have a new fresh look and want to develop that from scratch. So in that case, you might decide, okay, let's decustomize that part, remove all these customizations and start from scratch here. Whereas with other things, you might be able to move that. Maybe it's a line of business application that is connected and most of the logic is actually happening somewhere else and you're just embedding. Then maybe your migration part is, okay, we only modernize that integration part, but actually the logic is somewhere else anyway and can remain as is. So there are many different approaches, and our tooling can help you to get these insights, to understand which direction you should go, and advise you also on the capabilities that are available in the target environment and how that matches and maps with the existing old customizations in order to make the informed decision which direction is the right one for each individual customizations that has been identified.
Totally agree, yes. Okay, Matt, thank you very much. We are running out of time a little bit, But before we end this interview today, I would like to ask you a question. So if you have the option to provide, let's say, just one advice or one recommendation to a client who is currently thinking about a migration from SharePoint on-premises to SharePoint Online, what would that be?
Very simple. Don't rush into it.
Yeah.
I think that is the biggest point of failure if you have pressure and rush into the migration without understanding actually what you are getting yourself into.
Yeah.
We have heard that from many organizations who basically think like, yeah, we know good enough. We start with the migration because we want to get done by deadline X. And then they suddenly realize within the migration where all these problems are that they didn't anticipate. So my personal recommendation is exactly what we've discussed in our entire conversation today, is assess the current environment in the first step and make a proper planning. Usually how I see that with many organizations, how they do that, they have a pre-migration project.
Yeah.
So they have a planning project where they do their detailed assessment, get all this information out. And of course, during the migration project, the actual migration project, you have to do that again because in the meantime, the entire environment has changed.
Yes.
But you're not getting into a crazy mess from the start because you have already a quite good overview about the complexity, the challenges, and many of these really complex parts, they will not change. The amount of data might change, which sites are migrated might change over the time, especially if it's a very large environment that has a long migration going on. But all these roadblocks that cost the most time and money to be burned at the end during the migration, they will most likely not change. And identifying these before you start and plan budget, time, schedule, how you structure the migration, that will really make the migration at the end the successful one, and not the one where suddenly you have to ask for more budget and more time and then again and again. So that is my personal experience and what I hear also from customers who successfully migrated. If you did the proper planning beforehand, then you are not running into problems during the migration.
I totally agree to that, and I think you can read my mind. My recommendation is a little bit different, but I totally agree to what you just said. But in my recent talks, and I talked a lot about migration preparation at conferences, so my talks usually end with a very specific recommendation, and that is my recommendation to not do lift and shift migrations. With the lift and shift, I mean, just take what you have in your source environment. Don't think about modernization, don't think about structures, don't think about adding additional metadata and so on. Just take what you have and move it over to SharePoint Online. So in that case, SharePoint Online is just used as a kind of file share in the cloud, for example, right? And with this, so many benefits are just spoiled, and I don't know if this is really beneficial for an organization. So my advice usually is at least spend a little bit of time, a little bit of efforts to assessments, to structures, so that organizations can move their files from a file share over to SharePoint Online and add some additional benefits. For sure, it makes sense to kind of lift and shift parts of the source environment. I totally agree to that. But what I mean is, don't take the entire source environment and move it over to SharePoint Online, because to me, this doesn't make sense. I don't know what you think about that.
I can totally underwrite that one as well.
Okay.
It's at the end, crap in, crap out. So
yes, you're right.
Of course, you do not want that. So you should use that opportunity during a migration to actually separate the things that have been grown, the sprawl that has happened, to clean that up and really focus on the things that matter in the future.
Yes.
So blindly moving everything from old environment or from Fileshare to the new environment is definitely never the recommendation. Some parts might be possible to lift and shift if it's very simple and if it's identified that it's still needed. But this is exactly where we discussed before, where we separate and identify what might be archived, what might be lifted and shifted, and what needs to be modified, modernized, restructured, and so on.
Exactly. Yes. Thank you very much. All right. I think we are at the end of today's talk. Thank you very much, Matt. It was a pleasure for me to talk to you again, and it was a personal pleasure for me to meet you again, and this time in Vancouver and not at a SharePoint conference in North America. Thank you very much for joining today's talk, and all the best for your future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the invite.